So, I'll be brutally honest, this was not the game I had planned to talk about in this video. Knights of Pen and Paper was first released for mobile devices in 2012, it was ported to actual systems in 2013, and has seen further re-releases on more modern consoles in the years since. The game received a sequel in 2015, the release of which followed a very similar trajectory. Both games were released by Paradox Interactive, best known for publishing a whole bunch of well-known titles such as Pillars of Eternity and Crusader Kings. The first was developed by Behold Studios, while the second was helmed by Kai Games. There was also a spin-off called Galaxy of Pen and Paper, which saw Behold return to deliver the format within a sci-fi setting. While I couldn't find any evidence of it on my accounts, I distinctly remember playing the first game on mobile shortly after it was released. Let the record reflect, I abhor mobile games for a slew of reasons that I won't go into right now, but something about this one really drew me in. And as best I can recall, I did enjoy what I played of it. That enjoyment was probably what led to me buying it on PC. I'm not gonna lie, I have no recollection of how or when this game wound up in my Steam library, but it's here and we're talking about it, okay? Knights of Pen and Paper could probably be best described as a sandbox turn-based RPG. The player not only gets control of up to 5 different characters of their creation, but also parts of the world around them. Let me explain. See, Knights of Pen and Paper's gimmick, an extremely sizable chunk of its gameplay, is largely centered around the fact that while you gain control of a party of adventurers as you would expect, you also have near complete control of the dungeon master that sits across from them, that being this fine chap here. That means you get to determine when to undertake specific quests and, much more prudently, create the composition of many combat encounters. Oftentimes, the challenge placed before your adventurers is entirely up to you. So yes, these games effectively, in a way, answer the question of what it would be like to be able to play tabletop Dungeons & Dragons alone, which by itself is awesome, because if you're like me, you don't have any friends. But does it work? Sorta. Both games are heavily based around their turn-based combat systems. You fill each seat with a party member generated from a list of pre-generated characters and a mix of classes that make up RPG staples. You can have a maximum of 5 at a time, and the second game expands on these systems by introducing stat lines that are affected by the bonuses of the new races of each character. The previously mentioned turn-based systems are incredibly traditional. Characters are put into an action order at the start, and then both sides proceed to wail on each other until one is defeated. And, that's pretty much it. Yeah, unfortunately, in the case of both games, traditional doesn't exactly mean deep. Characters have a selection of 4 abilities, being either active or passive, that you can choose to skill in as you level. While this type of agency might seem like an area of player expression, classes are never really capable of filling roles outside of the expected, either being offensive, defensive, or utility. The combat itself is very simplistic, often requiring nothing more than common sense to make it through whatever you put in front of yourself. Whereas you have ample ability to thwart the actions of your enemies through weakening spells, status effects, and stuns, the sentient experience drops often don't, and if they do, they typically aren't smart enough to use them to make an impact. The one place that the game does try to add depth, through the use of an aggression-based threat system, which determines who enemies are more likely to attack based on how high it is, struggles to have any real bearing. More often than not, especially in the first game, the characters you want to have high threat levels, such as your tanks, are so adept at drawing attention that the other characters of your party, those being the ones that are actually dealing the lion's share of your damage, are never in any real danger of being hit. And for as fun as equipping characters with the accessories and trinkets you collect over the course of your adventures is, the games are saddled with carryovers from the fact that they were developed as mobile games. In order to upgrade weapons and armor, you need to partake in a game of chance with the blacksmith, who may or may not, depending on how much time you've invested to bring him material to improve his skills, succeed in crafting the shiny new sword you want. There are no in-app purchases in the non-mobile releases, meaning that you get to grind for all the gold that you're inevitably going to waste trying to forge suitable weaponry to proceed with. In the past, I've been pretty nonchalant about how important depth of gameplay is in shorter experiences, and I would have been thrilled to keep that same energy here, but I simply can't because combat is nearly everything on offer in both titles. Everything you do comes back, in some way, to combat. Whether you're designing the encounters yourself or taking on quests, Even those that are based around collecting items or escorting people from one place to another feature huge amounts of combat. A lot of times, quests are just glorified grinding sessions, with how fast you complete them contingent on how many enemies you can reasonably put yourself against at once. Due to the sheer amount of it on display, it can get very redundant very quickly. In all fairness, redundancy is something that plagues games that provide even the best executions of turn-based combat. It's somewhat inevitable that, after suffering through a swath of random encounters and other miscellaneous fights, that you'll find yourself mindlessly mashing the attack button far more than you'd want to. But these games take this to an extreme. Not to mention, those other games often make up for this fact with great boss battles and engaging stories. The Knights of Pen and Paper games feature boss battles that are likely easier than much of what you put in front of yourself, mainly because the bosses are often fought alone, and the story, while there, is pretty much just that. Neither of them are necessarily bad, and there are aspects of them that I'll touch on later that I actually quite enjoyed, but they don't provide anything of note either. I also really would have liked to see more ability to act as the dungeon master. You can't create your own quests or decide how rewards are doled out, so the luster of getting control of both sides of the table wanes fairly quickly. Now, you might be thinking, wow, that is a lot of criticism heaped onto the most important parts of these games. And you would be right, but the reason I felt the need to divulge many of my issues with the game was the fact that, in spite of everything I just mentioned, I could not stop playing either of these games. What was originally a relaxation session after the entirely depressing I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream video turned into the topic of this video because I had used all my time budget playing this series. So what was it that kept me trucking along? Charm. And a lot of it. For starters, both of these games look phenomenal. The pixelated artwork is colorful with a lot of expression evident in the details. Character sprites have a surprising amount of depth to them, and a lot of combat animations are very clean and do more than a suitable job conveying what's going on. The second game does look a bit better than the first. It's fuller in its graphical style, if that makes any sense, and it's actually widescreen. Seriously, why was the first game not? Also, I can't think of where else to mention it, so here is as good a place as any, I guess. But I love the map screen. The dice animation, the look of the map itself, the horse traveling on the routes. It's a really simple thing, but there is a lot of character crammed into this screen right here. And speaking of character, the different upgrades to the room were easily my favorite thing to spend my hard-earned gold on. Being able to customize the table while receiving an assortment of combat benefits was really fulfilling. I want a suit of armor in my game room, dude. Hell, I want a game room, period. Both games are positively loaded with cultural references and Easter eggs. They're found in the areas you travel to, the characters you meet, and sometimes even the dialogue itself. The game can get very meta at times, and honestly, that's when I thought it was at its best. Those aforementioned story elements I enjoyed were largely driven by the on-the-nose, self-referential moments that really start to make up a lot of both stories. Yes, I realize what I just said, that the stories are better when they stick to sillier elements, but that's not a bad thing, especially because the actual stories themselves aren't all that serious to begin with. The meta moments bring a certain amount of appreciable levity. These games are decidedly casual in nature, and the elements that reflect that only serve to enhance that fact. Like this scene where the game's developers show up. This is awesome, and then you get to add them to your party afterwards. This might sound really weird, but I love the fact that both of these games were developed and released before the Critical Role-induced boom of online tabletop gaming really started to take effect. Don't get me wrong, I love Critical Role, to the point that I have kicked the tires on a potential video about it. But if there's one bad thing that it's done, it's the fact that it has convinced a whole lot of people that this is what tabletop gaming is supposed to look like. No. Tabletop gaming with your friends is about stuffing your face with unhealthy snacks, finding as many ways as possible to make combat unnecessarily difficult, and petty arguments over plot holes. All of that is present here with a lot of fittingly out-of-character moments in the dialogue and lampshade hanging on how similar certain aspects are to each other, perfectly befitting a typical homebrew home game. I understand that for the overwhelming majority of this video, I have spoken about these games as one and the same, and that's on purpose. They are incredibly similar to each other, though the first game gets a slight edge in my book. The second game really doesn't add much at all, and the new aspects it does bring, such as crafting and terrain effects, are largely unimpactful. It's also way shorter, which, considering the first game wasn't all that long, isn't a great thing. It feels like a glorified expansion pack, and not in a good way. And while I don't think either translated particularly well to proper gaming systems, I could very plainly see why I liked this when I played it on mobile. Compared to most of the trash that litters mobile app stores, both of them are a clear cut above the rest. If I had to suffer through some sort of commute or something like that as part of my daily life, there's probably little else that I would want to play to pass the time with. They're suited for mobile devices, and that's okay. It doesn't make the fact that they've been ported to more advanced systems a bad thing. If you're in the market for something easier to play, not to mention a pair of games that can just make you smile with some heavy doses of self-awareness, both of these games will likely scratch that itch. Their presentation alone makes them worth their relatively low cost. Just be warned that they can find themselves a bit redundant at times, and they don't really stack up all that well against console and PC titles. That being said, the entire pen and paper series is often bundled together in online stores for pretty cheap, and that alone might sway your decision making. And if you're on mobile, go crazy. I sincerely doubt, even with my admittedly limited knowledge of current day mobile titles, that there's much better on offer.